Nova Prime was a beautiful world, a shining jewel in humanity's expanding reach across the stars. Its cities were growing, its people thriving, and its defenses, though present, were nothing compared to the might of the Exalvoran Empire. When the sky burned red with the arrival of the Exalvoran war fleet, there were no warning shots, no diplomatic transmissions, only the thunderous descent of drop pods and the deafening roar of orbital bombardment. Buildings crumbled as plasma fire rained down, and the people of Nova Prime, scientists, farmers, engineers, and their families scrambled for shelter. They had known war was always a possibility, but they had never expected it to come so suddenly, so brutally. The Exalvoran had invaded countless worlds before, crushing resistance with overwhelming numbers and advanced firepower. To General Vexus Corps, this was nothing more than another swift conquest, a simple operation that would add yet another human world to their growing list of victories. He expected the same result as always: terror, surrender, submission. But what he failed to understand was that this time, the humans were ready. T first. The battle unfolded exactly as Vexus Corps had predicted. Xalvoran soldiers, towering reptilian warriors clad in thick armor, marched through the cities unchallenged, their heavy boots echoing off shattered streets. The automated turrets were disabled within hours, the planetary defense grid reduced to smoking rubble. The humans, it seemed, had no army waiting to fight. There were no organized battalions rushing to meet them, no grand warships appearing to challenge their fleet. It was almost disappointing. Vexus Corps had heard much about humanity's stubbornness, their so-called defiance, but so far he saw nothing that impressed him. He expected them to beg for mercy within the day. But as his forces moved deeper into the colony, something changed. The war, which had started as an easy conquest, took a dark and unpredictable turn. The first sign of resistance came from the shadows. Xalvoran's scouting units disappeared without a trace, their last transmissions filled with the sounds of distant gunfire and something worse, silence. Then, the ambushes began. It was not an open fight, not the large-scale battle that the Exalvoran were prepared for. It was something far more terrifying. Small human strike teams moved like ghosts, striking with brutal efficiency before vanishing back into the ruins. They didn't fight fair. They didn't fight to hold ground. They fought to kill. They used the terrain against their enemy, setting traps, detonating explosives at the perfect moment, and turning the ruins into a battlefield of their own making. Every alley, every collapsed building, every underground tunnel became a potential death zone. The Exalvoran had never seen anything like it. They were used to enemies that stood and fought. Vexus Corps soon realized that these were not ordinary soldiers. These humans did not charge blindly into battle. They fought smart. They adapted. They learned. Every failed Exalvoran assault was met with new countermeasures. If the Exalvoran sent heavy units, the humans lured them into tight corridors and destroyed them with precision strikes. If they tried to secure supply routes, the humans attacked from unseen angles, cutting them off and leaving them stranded. The Exalvoran were larger, stronger, and better armed, but none of it mattered. The humans were using tactics that defied everything Vexus Corps knew about war. What disturbed him the most was the psychological effect. His warriors were trained for battle, but they were not trained to be prey. Fear spread among them, whispering like a disease. Soldiers spoke of shadows that moved without a sound, of comrades who vanished without a trace, of traps that seemed placed by an enemy who knew their every move before they even made it. Reports came in of Exalvoran squads surrendering, not because they were defeated, but because they were too afraid to continue. These humans were not fighting for victory. They were fighting for survival, and that made them unstoppable. Desperate to regain control, Vexus Corps ordered a full planetary lockdown, sending his best warriors to hunt down the human resistance. He deployed combat mechs, aerial drones, and tracker units to flush them out. But it didn't work. If anything, it made things worse. The more pressure he applied, the more the humans adapted. They found ways to disable his machines, hack into his surveillance systems, and turn his own technology against him. It was a nightmare unlike anything he had faced before. The war had become something he never expected, a test of survival, and the Exalvoran were losing. Sitting in his command chamber aboard the warship Krathul, Vexus Kor studied the battle reports with growing unease. The casualties were rising, not in great numbers, but steadily, relentlessly. It was clear now this was no ordinary rebellion, no mere act of defiance. This was something far more dangerous. The humans were learning his strategies, predicting his movements, countering his every decision. He had seen stubborn enemies before, but never one that adapted like this. Never one that fought as if they had nothing to lose. And as he stared at the latest report, an entire Exalvoran battalion wiped out in a single night, a disturbing realization settled over him. For the first time in his career, General Vexus Kor did not feel like the hunter. He felt like the hunted. And this was only the beginning. The battlefield of Nova Prime had changed. The Exalvoran had come expecting a simple conquest, an easy victory against what they believed to be an inferior species. But the humans had refused to fight the way their enemies wanted. They didn't meet the Exalvoran in open battle, didn't march in neat formations, didn't stand where they could be crushed by superior firepower. Instead, they vanished into the ruins, struck from the shadows, and turned the once thriving colony into a war zone unlike anything the Exalvoran had ever faced. General Vexus Kor stood aboard his command ship, his sharp yellow eyes scanning the latest reports, and for the first time in his career, a feeling of unease crept into his thoughts. He was not fighting an army, he was fighting ghosts. His troops were the most advanced warriors the Empire had to offer, but one by one they were falling. Patrols sent into the city failed to return. Supply convoys were ambushed before they could reach their destinations. Explosions erupted in the night, destroying vital equipment and cutting off communication lines. His soldiers had every technological advantage, yet they were being hunted like prey. The war was no longer about firepower. It had become a game of survival, and the humans were winning. The fear among his troops was growing. Zalvoran soldiers, once proud and battle-hardened, now moved hesitantly through the city ruins. Their heavy armor and advanced weaponry did nothing against an enemy that refused to be seen. Warriors who had conquered dozens of worlds now hesitated before stepping into dark alleys, their claws tightening around their weapons. Some spoke in hushed voices of the horrors they had witnessed, entire squads being taken down before they could even react, ambushes so precise that it seemed as if the humans knew their every move in advance. There were whispers of soldiers being dragged into the darkness, their screams cut short before they could call for help. Even worse were the stories of the phantom soldiers, humans who never seemed to run out of bullets, who moved faster than the eye could track, who never missed a shot. It was impossible, of course, but fear made even the strongest warriors believe in ghosts. Vexus Kor had never seen his army like this before. These were soldiers bred for war, trained from birth to fight. Others were making mistakes, shooting at shadows, wasting ammunition on enemies that weren't even there. It was psychological warfare at its finest, and the humans were masters of it. Vexus Kor knew he needed to regain control. He deployed his best warriors, the Exalvoran Dread Hunters, elite soldiers with years of experience in urban warfare. Their task was simple: flush out the human resistance and crush them before they could do any more damage. The Dread Hunters moved with confidence, using tracking drones to locate enemy hideouts, deploying war beasts to sniff out human hiding places, and setting up traps of their own. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the tide was turning. Several human hideouts were destroyed, a few resistance fighters were captured, and for the first time since the invasion began, the Exalvoran felt like they had the upper hand. But then, the humans adapted once again. They turned the hunt against the hunters. The Dread Hunters, who had been so eager to track down the enemy, soon found themselves being tracked instead. Used to lure Exalvoran forces into false locations, while the real resistance moved freely. The war beasts, once considered unstoppable trackers, were found dead in the streets, their massive bodies torn apart with surgical precision. Every attempt to tighten the noose around the humans only made the noose tighten around the Exalvoran instead. It was as if the humans were always one step ahead. It made no sense. The Exalvoran were supposed to be the superior species. They had conquered dozens of worlds, wiped out entire civilizations, and fought against enemies far stronger than humanity. And yet, this time, something was different. These humans weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting to win. As the days passed, the situation grew worse. Supply lines were cut, leaving Exelvoran forces stranded without food or energy cells for their weapons. Medical stations were bombed, preventing the wounded from receiving treatment. Fuel depots were destroyed in coordinated strikes, crippling entire sections of the invasion force. Morale dropped to an all-time low. Some soldiers began questioning the invasion, wondering if it was worth fighting an enemy that refused to break. Others secretly wished for retreat, whispering that this war was unwinnable. Vex's Core refused to believe it. He had led his forces to victory time and time again. He was a war veteran, a conqueror, a leader who had never known defeat. But as he watched another fleet transport explode in the distance, sending flames into the dark sky, he felt something he had never experienced before: doubt. His thoughts were interrupted by an urgent transmission. One of his remaining officers appeared on the screen, his expression tense. "General, we have a problem." Vex's Core narrowed his eyes. "Another attack?" The officer hesitated, his hesitation alone a sign that something was terribly wrong. "No, sir, it's worse than that." He took a breath before delivering the news that sent a chill down Vex's Core's spine. "They've started targeting our officers." The humans were no longer just attacking supply lines in small squads. They were eliminating leadership. High-ranking Exelvoran commanders were being assassinated one by one, taken out with precision shots, or found dead in their quarters with their throats slit. This was not the work of desperate survivors. This was the work of professionals, warriors who knew exactly how to dismantle an invasion force from the inside. And they were succeeding. Vex's Core clenched his fists. This was not how it was supposed to be. The humans should have been crushed by now. The colony should have been secured. Instead, he was watching his invasion fall apart piece by piece. The war was slipping through his fingers, and the worst part was that he still didn't know how to stop it. The humans had no warships, no heavy artillery, no great armies, and yet they were winning. For the first time in his life, General Vex's Core was beginning to understand something terrifying. He was not fighting a species that feared death. He was fighting a species that embraced war. The once mighty Exalvoran war machine was crumbling from within. It was not a lack of firepower, nor was it a lack of resources that was undoing them. It was something far worse. Fear. The kind of fear that gnawed at the mind, that crept into the heart even of the strongest warriors. The invasion of Nova Prime, which should have been a swift and decisive conquest, had turned into a nightmare. Instead of marching victoriously through human cities, the Exelvoran soldiers found themselves trapped in a war unlike anything they had ever experienced. It was a war fought not with grand armies, but with shadows, whispers, and sudden, precise strikes. The humans did not fight fair. They did not fight like prey. Exelvoran patrols moved in larger groups now, but it did little to help. No matter how many warriors marched together, no matter how heavily armed they still disappeared. Some were taken by sniper fire silent shots that pierced even the thickest armor, leaving bodies crumpled in the streets before anyone could react. Others were caught in carefully laid traps, their remains left as grim warnings for the rest. Some patrols simply vanished, their last transmissions filled with nothing but static. The survivors told tales that no one wanted to believe, stories of humans moving through the ruins like ghosts, of figures that struck with inhuman precision, of warriors whose eyes glowed in the dark, appearing for mere seconds before disappearing again. The Exelvoran had fought countless species before, but never one that made them feel like they were being hunted. Inside the Exelvoran command center, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Officers who had once spoken with confidence now argued in hushed voices, their claws tapping nervously against their consoles. General Vex's Core listened to their reports with an unreadable expression, but inside, he felt something he never had before: helplessness. His fleet was still in orbit, his soldiers still outnumbered the remaining human resistance, but none of it seemed to matter. The enemy was not fighting a war of strength. They were fighting a war of psychology, and they were winning. Soldiers were beginning to crack under the pressure. Some refused to go on night patrols. Others flinched at every sound, their nerves frayed beyond repair. Worse still, some had started to desert. This was unheard of. The Exalvoran Empire prided itself on discipline, on loyalty, on fearlessness in the face of battle. But now, entire squads were abandoning their posts, attempting to flee back to the ships, only to be found dead the next morning, their bodies left in the streets as if to send a message. Vexus Kor clenched his fists. He had underestimated the humans. He had thought they would break. That was how every invasion worked. Crush their defenses, destroy their leadership, instill terror, and force surrender. But these humans had done something no other species had done before they had turned that fear against their invaders. They were not just resisting. They were hunting. The reports kept coming. Supply depots were being raided with surgical precision, not destroyed randomly, but targeted in ways that maximized disruption. Fuel stations were sabotaged, medical facilities wiped out, leaving the wounded to die slow, painful deaths. Even the fleet in orbit was not safe. Somehow, the humans had launched a stealth assault against one of the Exalvoran support ships, boarding it in the dead of night. By the time reinforcements arrived, the entire crew had been slaughtered, and the ship had been rigged with explosives before being sent crashing into the surface of the planet. Panic was spreading. The warriors who had once mocked the idea of human resistance now spoke of the enemy in hushed voices. They do not sleep. They see in the dark. They know our every move. It was nonsense, of course, but fear had a way of twisting the mind. Every shadow became a threat, every sound a possible attack. The Exalvoran prided themselves on their ability to dominate weaker species. But what happened when that same species refused to be weak? Vexus Kor knew that if he did not act soon, the invasion would collapse completely. He needed to take back control, to remind his soldiers of their strength. He ordered mass executions of captured humans, broadcasting their deaths to the entire invasion force to break the morale of the resistance. But it did not have the effect he had hoped for. The humans did not beg, did not scream. Some even laughed, their dying words filled with defiance, not fear. And the attacks only grew worse after that. The executions had not demoralized the humans. They had enraged them. Then came the final blow. One of his own commanders was assassinated. Not in battle, not in the ruins, but inside the heavily fortified command center itself. The security footage showed nothing, just an empty hallway one moment, and then the commander's lifeless body slumped over his desk the next. No alarms had been triggered, no signs of forced entry. It was as if the humans had walked through the walls themselves. The soldiers guarding the room were found dead as well, their throats slit before they could even fire a shot. Vexus Kor could feel it now. The war was already lost. It didn't matter how many ships were in orbit. It didn't matter how much firepower they had left. The Exalvoran were fighting something they didn't understand, something that went against everything they had learned about war. The humans were relentless, their tactics ever-changing, their ability to adapt beyond anything the Exalvoran had prepared for. And worst of all, they had broken the will of their invaders. In the silence of his war room, General Vexus Kor stared at the holographic map of Nova Prime, watching as red markers his forces continued to disappear, one after another. They were being wiped out. Not in grand battles, not by overwhelming firepower, but piece by piece, until nothing remained. For the first time, the thought entered his mind, a thought so alien to him that he almost couldn't accept it. Retreat. The Exalvoran Empire did not retreat. It was against everything they stood for. But what was left to fight for? What would be left of his army if they stayed? As if to mock him, another explosion rocked the ground outside, the sound of human resistance growing louder in the distance. The shadows of war had consumed Nova Prime, and the mighty Exalvoran Empire had become nothing more than prey. The war for Nova Prime had reached its breaking point. The Exalvoran invasion force, once confident in its victory, now stood on the edge of collapse. What had started as a routine conquest had turned into a nightmare. Their armies were no longer advancing. Their soldiers, once proud and fearless, now moved with hesitation, their nerves shattered by the relentless human resistance. Every battle, every ambush, every night spent in terror had drained them. Supplies were running low, their communications were breaking down, and morale had plummeted to an all-time low. But General Vex's Corps still refused to accept defeat. He had spent his life leading conquests, bringing countless worlds under the rule of the Exalvoran Empire. He would not let a primitive species change that. Even as his forces dwindled, even as reports of desertion increased, he believed there was still a way to turn the tide. Inside the heavily fortified command center, the last of his officers gathered. Their eyes were filled with uncertainty. They spoke of retreat, of cutting their losses and regrouping, but Vex's Corps silenced them with a single command. We do not run. We break them. Here. Now. He had devised a final plan, one that would either save the invasion or end it completely. He would gather all remaining forces for one last, overwhelming strike at the heart of the human resistance. No more scattered patrols. No more waiting in fear. A full-scale, coordinated assault that would crush the enemy before they had time to react. It was a desperate move, but desperation was all he had left. The Exalvoran forces moved out at dawn, their massive war machines rolling through the shattered streets, soldiers marching in tight formations, weapons locked and ready. This time, they did not spread out. They moved as a single, unstoppable wave, sweeping through the ruins with brutal efficiency. Any human position they encountered was obliterated instantly. Buildings were torn apart, tunnels collapsed, entire blocks leveled to the ground. The humans fought back with everything they had: sniper fire from hidden locations, explosives planted in strategic choke points, surprise attacks that came from the shadows. But for the first time in weeks, the Exalvoran pushed forward. It was brutal, it was costly, but it was working. The resistance was being forced back. For a brief moment, Vex's Corps felt something he had not felt in a long time: hope. Perhaps they had finally broken the enemy's spirit. Perhaps this war could still be won. But that hope was shattered the moment his lead forces reached the old human command center. They expected a last stand, a desperate defense. Instead, they found it abandoned. The entire facility had been emptied. Weapons were left behind, supplies untouched. It was a trap, but not the kind they were expecting. Before his soldiers could react, a low rumble echoed through the ruins. The ground beneath them shook violently, and then, without warning, the entire city block collapsed. The humans had spent weeks preparing for this moment. They had lured the Exalvoran into a kill zone. Explosions erupted from below as underground tunnels filled with detonations, burying entire squads under tons of rubble. Those who survived the collapse found themselves disoriented, cut off from their units. And then the true attack began. The humans struck like ghosts, emerging from hidden tunnels, attacking from vantage points that no one had expected. Zalvoran soldiers, already weakened from weeks of stress and exhaustion, panicked. Some fought back, others ran, but it didn't matter, their fate was already sealed. They had walked into a slaughter. The resistance fighters moved with terrifying precision. Their weapons never missed. Their attacks were ruthless. The Exalvoran's final push had turned into their greatest disaster. The streets ran red with the blood of the invaders. Inside the command center, Vex's Corps watched the battle unfold on his tactical display. His fists clenched as he saw his forces being torn apart, piece by piece. His officers, who had once spoken of victory, now stood in horrified silence. The turning point had come, but not in their favor. The invasion was lost. There was